The carriage wheel cracked on the stone bridge, and Edmund Ashworth was thrown hard against the door before the horses reared, and the whole frame tilted toward the river below. He grabbed the window frame with both hands, his heart slamming against his ribs, and for one long breath, he was certain the carriage would tip over the edge and take him with it. The driver shouted something lost in the wind and the sound of the frightened horses. Edmund kicked the door open and dropped onto the bridge just as the carriage groaned, shifted, and settled crooked against the low stone wall, one wheel spinning uselessly in the air. The driver, a thick-set man named Peter Odgers, hired only for this journey, and unaware of his passenger's true identity, staggered to his feet, clutching a bleeding hand where the reins had torn through his glove, and together they stared at the wreckage in silence for a long moment before either could find words. He stood there in the cold evening light, breathing hard, watching the near disaster with a strange kind of clarity. This was not the first accident of the week, and he had begun to wonder if it was truly an accident at all. 2 nights earlier, a loose plank on the stable stairs had sent him sprawling. The week before that, a hunting rifle he had not loaded had somehow discharged while cleaning it in his own study. He had told himself each time that it was carelessness, bad luck, nothing more. But standing on that cracked bridge, with the river rushing below, he no longer believed it. Edmund Ashworth was the heir to one of the largest estates in the county, a young man of good breeding and a restless mind, and for the last several weeks he had been quietly making an enemy of someone he could not yet name. He had not set out to make enemies. He had set out, 6 weeks earlier, to find the truth about the 4 women his father wanted him to marry. His father, Lord Ashworth, was dying slowly of a weak heart, and his last great wish was to see his son settled before he passed. 4 families had put forward their daughters as suitable matches: the Whitmores, the Langleys, the Fairfaxes, and the Sinclairs. Edmund had met all 4 young women at balls and dinners, had bowed over their gloved hands and exchanged polite conversation about weather and music, and had come away from every meeting with the same uneasy feeling. He did not know any of them. He knew only the performance they gave for a nobleman who might make them a countess. So he had done something reckless. With the help of his old steward, a careful and loyal man named Higgins, Edmund had staged his own retreat from society, claiming a hunting injury and a long recovery abroad, and had taken on the disguise of a footman named Edwin Hart. As Edwin, plain and unremarkable, he had found service first in the household of Lady Cordelia Whitmore, and there he had seen a side of her that no ballroom ever revealed, a woman who smiled sweetly at guests and turned cold and sharp the moment the doors closed, who once reduced a young housemaid to tears over a spilled tray of tea and thought nothing of it. He had left that post troubled, but resolved to continue his search, moving next into the household of Lady Beatrice Langley, where he found not arrogance, but a fierce and lonely intelligence trapped behind a sharp tongue, a woman who defended a wrongly accused footman when it would have cost her nothing to stay silent. It was during his time in the Langley household that the accidents had begun. At first, Edmund dismissed each incident as the ordinary hazards of a working life he was not used to. A gentleman raised in comfort did not know how heavy a hay cart truly was, or how slick stone stairs could be in the rain, and so when the cart nearly rolled over his foot, and when he slipped on the Langley staircase and caught himself only by luck, he blamed his own inexperience. But the rifle that fired itself in his own locked study, in his true home, while he was miles away pretending to be a footman, could not be explained by clumsiness. Someone had been in his house. Someone knew, or suspected, what he was doing. Now, standing on the broken bridge, with the wreck of the carriage behind him, and the driver limping toward him with a cut above his eye, Edmund understood that his secret was no longer entirely safe, and that whoever wanted to stop him was willing to risk lives to do it. He helped the driver down from the bridge and checked the horses, both of which were shaken, but unhurt, and together they walked the last mile into the village in silence, Edmund's mind turning over every person who might have reason to want his search ended. Higgins knew, of course, but Higgins had been loyal to the Ashworth family since before Edmund was born, and there was no version of the truth where Higgins wished him harm. Someone else, then. A rival for the estate, perhaps. Someone who stood to gain if Edmund never married and never produced an heir. Or perhaps one of the 4 families themselves, if word of his disguise had somehow slipped free and reached someone who feared what he might discover. Before returning to the inn, Edmund walked the length of the village street once, slowly, watching every face that passed him in the dim evening light, searching for anyone who lingered too long near the bridge, or watched him with more interest than a passing stranger deserved. He saw nothing but ordinary villagers going about their evening business, farmers leading tired horses home, a baker closing his shutters, children chasing a dog between two cottages, and yet the feeling of being watched did not leave him, a cold prickle at the back of his neck that refused to be reasoned away. He thought back over the weeks since he had first taken up the name Edwin Hart, trying to recall any moment when his disguise might have slipped, any conversation where he had spoken too freely or moved with too much confidence for a common footman. He remembered a dinner at Whitmore Hall, when he had corrected a visiting scholar's poor Latin without thinking, drawing a curious glance from a passing housemaid. He remembered, too, a moment at Langley House, when he had reached instinctively for the correct fork at a servant's meal, a small habit of breeding that a true footman would never have possessed. Any one of these slips, noticed by the wrong person and reported to the wrong ears, might have been enough to unravel the entire scheme. He did not sleep well that night, in the small inn-room Higgins had arranged for him under a false name. He lay awake, listening to the wind rattle the shutters, turning the problem over and over, and by morning, he had made a decision. He could not stop his search, not now, not when he had already glimpsed enough of Cordelia and Beatrice to know how much truth lay hidden beneath the polished manners of noble life. If anything, the danger only confirmed that he was close to something important, some truth that someone badly wanted buried. He sent Higgins ahead to the Fairfax estate, with a letter requesting a position for a footman, using the name Edwin Hart once more, and within the week he was standing in the servants' hall of Fairfax Manor, wearing plain wool and carrying a tray of correspondence to the young mistress of the house. Lady Rosalind Fairfax was, by every account he had heard at court, the gentlest and most sheltered of the four candidates, a young woman raised almost entirely within the walls of her family's estate, by a mother who feared the world beyond the gates. Edmund had expected, from the stories, a timid and colorless girl with little to say for herself. What he found instead, in his first days at Fairfax Manor, surprised him. Rosalind spoke to every servant by name. She asked the cook about her aching knees, and remembered to ask again the following week. She noticed when a new stable boy looked lonely, and found small excuses to draw him into conversation about horses, a subject he clearly loved and rarely got to discuss. And on his third day in the house, when Edmund himself stumbled while carrying a stack of books to the library and sent them scattering across the polished floor, it was Rosalind who knelt down beside him, without hesitation to help gather them, ignoring the shocked look from the housekeeper, who thought it beneath her station. "You needn't look so afraid," Rosalind said quietly, handing him a leather-bound volume of poetry. "Books forgive being dropped. People are what break." It was such a strange and thoughtful thing for a sheltered young woman to say that Edmund, still playing the part of Edwin Hart, found himself looking at her properly for the first time, past the powdered courtesy he remembered from their brief meeting at court months earlier. There was something behind her quiet manner, something watchful and curious, as though she had spent her whole life observing a world she was rarely permitted to join. Over the following days, Edmund watched Rosalind more closely than his duties strictly required, and the picture that formed surprised him further still. Her mother, Lady Fairfax, ruled the household with a firm and anxious hand, forbidding her daughter from riding beyond the estate boundaries, from attending gatherings without a chaperone at every moment, from even reading certain books deemed unsuitable for a young lady's tender sensibilities. Rosalind bore these restrictions without complaint in her mother's presence, but Edmund began to notice small rebellions tucked into the quiet corners of her days. A forbidden novel, hidden inside the cover of an approved volume of sermons, a habit of slipping into the walled garden alone at dusk when her mother believed her resting, a way of asking the traveling merchants who visited the estate detailed questions about the towns and cities they had passed through, as though she were building a map of a world she had never been allowed to see with her own eyes. He found himself wondering, as he carried trays and delivered messages through the quiet halls of Fairfax Manor, whether Rosalind's gentleness was truly a fixed part of her character, or simply the only shape a spirited nature could take when squeezed through years of careful confinement. It was a question he could not yet answer, but it was one that made her, in his private estimation, far more interesting than the sheltered and colorless girl the rest of society believed her to be. But even as he began to warm to her kindness, the shadow of the accidents followed him. That very evening, Carrying a lantern down to the stables to check on the horses before bed, Edmund noticed the smell of oil too strong near the hay, and when he lifted the lantern higher he saw that a length of rope had been strung low across the stable doorway, nearly invisible in the dim light, exactly where a man carrying a lit lantern might trip and send both himself and the flame crashing into dry straw. He stopped just short of the rope, his pulse hammering, and stood there for a long moment staring at it in the flickering light. This was no accident of carelessness. This was a trap, set deliberately, in a household he had only just entered, by someone who knew he would walk this path with a lantern in his hand. He crouched down and studied the rope carefully before cutting it away and coiling it into his pocket, his mind racing. Whoever was behind this had followed him from the Langley estate to Fairfax Manor, or else had agents in more than one household, which meant the danger was larger and more organized than a single jealous rival. He thought again of the 4 families competing for his hand, of the fortune and title that would come to whichever daughter he chose, and a colder thought settled into his chest. Perhaps someone did not want him to choose wisely. Perhaps someone wanted him gone entirely, so that the Ashworth estate might pass to another branch of the family, one more easily controlled or more willing to share its wealth. He said nothing to anyone in the household that night, but he wrote a careful letter to Higgins, using a code they had agreed upon before this whole scheme began, describing the rope and the rifle and the carriage wheel, and asking his old friend to quietly investigate who among the estate's many relatives and creditors might benefit most from Edmund's death or disappearance. The letter sent, Edmund lay in his narrow servant's bed staring at the ceiling, and found his thoughts returning, against his will, to the gentle voice of Lady Rosalind Fairfax, kneeling on the library floor, unafraid to lower herself to help a servant she believed to be nothing more than a footman. He did not yet know if she was the woman his father hoped he would marry. He did not even know, with any certainty, if he would live long enough to find out. But for the first time since the carriage wheel had cracked on the stone bridge, he felt something other than fear. He felt a stubborn, burning determination to see this through, to protect the household of every woman he served in disguise, and to uncover both the truth of their hearts and the identity of the person trying to end his search before it was finished. He spent the following days dividing his attention carefully between his duties in Anne's study and his quiet, patient watch over Walter's movements, gathering small observations, the way he had once gathered impressions of noble ladies at court, except now, the stakes were sharper, and the danger closer than any ballroom conversation had ever carried. He noted the times Walter left the house, the direction he favored when he thought no one watched, the particular tension that entered his shoulders whenever Anne's father mentioned the ongoing investigation into the accidents at the other estates. None of it was proof, but all of it deepened Edmund's unease, and he found himself sleeping with one eye open, his small knife never far from his hand, uncertain any longer which of the strangers around him might be exactly what they appeared to be. The next morning brought fresh trouble. A message arrived at Fairfax Manor from the Whitmore estate, carried by a breathless young rider, informing the household that Lady Cordelia Whitmore had suffered a fall down her own staircase in the night, and now lay unconscious, her physician uncertain whether she would wake. Edmund, standing near the servants' entrance when the news arrived, felt the color drain from his face. Cordelia, whatever her flaws, whatever cruelty he had witnessed toward her servants, did not deserve to be caught in whatever web was closing around him. If her fall was connected to his investigation, if someone believed harming the women in his life might frighten him into abandoning his search, then his secret disguise had already cost an innocent person dearly, and he could not allow it to cost anyone else. He requested leave from his duties that afternoon, claiming a family matter, and rode hard for the Whitmore estate under cover of dusk, his borrowed footman's coat flapping behind him, his mind fixed on a single question that would not leave him alone through the long ride. Was Cordelia's fall truly an accident, as everyone assumed, or was it the first casualty in a war he had not known he was fighting? Edmund reached Whitmore Hall well after midnight, his horse lathered with sweat, and found the great house lit from top to bottom, servants moving through the halls with lanterns and worried faces. He gave his name as Edwin Hart, claiming to be a messenger sent ahead by a concerned neighbor, and was allowed as far as the entrance hall before a stern housekeeper stopped him and demanded to know his business. He had no good answer ready, and for a moment, He feared his whole disguise would collapse right there on the marble floor. But a familiar voice called down from the staircase above and saved him. "Let him wait in the kitchen," said Lady Beatrice Langley, descending the stairs with her dark hair loose and her face pale with worry. Cordelia would want every kindness shown to a stranger who rode through the night to ask after her. Edmund had not expected to find Beatrice here, but of course the four families moved in the same small circle, and news of a tragedy would draw them together quickly. He allowed himself to be led to the kitchen, grateful for Beatrice's unknowing protection, and there he learned from the frightened housemaids what had happened. Lady Cordelia had been walking down the grand staircase alone, late in the evening, when her foot caught on something at the top step, and she pitched forward, tumbling nearly the full length of the stairs, before a footman found her at the bottom, unmoving. One of the maids, a nervous girl no older than 16, whispered that she had seen a thin cord stretched across the top step earlier that same evening, while dusting the banister, but had assumed it was nothing, perhaps a stray thread from a rug, and had not thought to mention it until now, when it was far too late. The burrito was cold. A cord across a staircase was no accident. It was the same method as the rope in the Fairfax stables, the same patient, careful cruelty, and it confirmed beyond doubt that whoever wished to end his search was not only targeting him, but was willing to harm the very women he had come to study. He excused himself from the kitchen and made his way, unseen, toward the grand staircase, where he examined the top step by the light of a single candle. There, caught on a splinter of wood near the banister post, was a single fine thread of dark cord, nearly invisible against the polished wood, exactly the sort of trap that had nearly caught him in the stable doorway 2 nights before. He pocketed the thread carefully and stood for a long moment at the top of the stairs, looking down at the spot where Cordelia had fallen, and felt something shift inside him. Whatever cold judgments he had made of her character during his time as her servant, whatever cruelty he had witnessed toward the housemaids, none of it made her deserving of this. She was, at the end of everything, a young woman fighting for her life in a room down the hall, and he could not simply walk away and continue his search as though nothing had happened. He found Beatrice again in the corridor outside Cordelia's bedchamber, sitting in a hard wooden chair with her hands folded tightly in her lap, refusing to leave despite the late hour. "You came a long way for a stranger's message," Beatrice said without looking up, her sharp eyes catching more than most people gave her credit for. "Who sent you, truly?" Edmund hesitated. It would have been easy to repeat his lie about a concerned neighbor, but something about the raw worry in her voice made him reluctant to add another falsehood to the pile already threatening to bury him. "A friend of the family," he said carefully, which was at least closer to the truth than anything else he had told that night. "I heard the news and could not stay away." Beatrice studied him for a long moment, and Edmund had the uncomfortable feeling that she saw more of him than any of the other women had, that her sharp mind was already turning over inconsistencies in his story, the way she might turn over a difficult puzzle. But whatever suspicions she had, she set them aside for the moment, too exhausted and too worried about her friend to press further. "The physician says she may wake by morning," Beatrice said instead, her voice softer now, "or she may not wake at all. He will not say which is more likely." He thought back to his weeks in Beatrice's own household, remembering how the servants there had spoken of her with a mixture of respect and wariness, careful never to cross her sharp tongue, but never once accusing her of true unkindness. He had watched her argue fiercely with her father over the management of the tenant farms, insisting on fairer terms for families struggling after a poor harvest, and had watched her father, red-faced and blustering, ultimately concede the point simply because her arguments were better reasoned than his own. It was not the behavior of a woman content to be decorative and silent, and Edmund had come away from that household with a grudging admiration he had not expected to feel. They sat together in that corridor through the rest of the night, an unlikely pair, a disguised nobleman and a sharp-tongued lady, who did not know she was speaking to the very man her family hoped she might marry. Beatrice spoke, in fits and starts, of her childhood friendship with Cordelia, of summers spent together before either of them understood the weight of the titles they would one day carry, of the way Cordelia's coldness toward servants had grown only after her own mother's harsh lessons about maintaining proper distance from those beneath her station. It was not an excuse, Beatrice said firmly, but perhaps it was an explanation, and there was a difference. Edmund listened, and found himself reconsidering everything he thought he understood about Cordelia, and about the danger closing in around all of them. If someone was willing to nearly kill a noblewoman to send a message, then his careful, patient investigation of 4 households had become something far more urgent than a search for a suitable wife. It had become a matter of protecting lives, and he no longer had the luxury of moving slowly from house to house, gathering impressions, one quiet observation at a time. As dawn broke over Whitmore Hall, word came that Lady Cordelia had opened her eyes. The relief that swept through the household was immediate and overwhelming, servants weeping openly in the corridors, Beatrice pressing both hands over her mouth to stifle a sob before rushing into the sick room. Edmund remained outside, watching through the half-open door as Cordelia, pale and bandaged but alive, reached for Beatrice's hand and whispered something too quiet for him to hear. Before he left, Edmund paused at the edge of the servants' stairwell and questioned the young maid, who had first noticed the cord, gently, and without alarming her further, asking whether she had seen anyone unfamiliar near the staircase that evening. She recalled, after some hesitant thought, a delivery man she did not recognize bringing wine up from the cellar earlier that night, a man none of the regular staff could later account for, who had vanished from the house before the alarm was even raised. It was a slim lead, but a lead nonetheless, and Edmund committed the maid's hesitant description to memory before he finally slipped away. He used the confusion of the moment to slip away from the house before anyone could question him further, riding back toward Fairfax Manor, with the fine dark thread still tucked safely in his coat pocket, evidence of a plot he was only beginning to understand. Somewhere between the Langley estate and the Fairfax stables and now the Whitmore staircase, someone had moved with terrible patience and skill, setting traps that could easily be mistaken for accidents, striking at exactly the moments when suspicion would be hardest to prove. He arrived back at Fairfax Manor, exhausted and filthy from the road, and was immediately met by an anxious Higgins, who had ridden through the night himself upon hearing rumors of the accident at Whitmore Hall. In the privacy of the old steward's temporary lodgings in the village, Edmund finally allowed himself to lay out everything he had learned: the rifle, the carriage wheel, the rope in the stable, and now the cord on the staircase, that had nearly killed Cordelia Whitmore. Higgins listened with a grim, tightening expression, and when Edmund finished, the old steward reached into his coat and produced a folded letter of his own. "I did as you asked," Higgins said. "I looked into who might benefit from your absence, should the worst happen to you before you marry and produce an heir." The letter contained a name Edmund had not expected, a distant cousin named Gerald Ashworth, a man he had met only a handful of times at family gatherings, who stood next in line for the estate should Edmund die without children of his own. Gerald had fallen into significant debt over the past 2 years, debt serious enough that his creditors had begun making quiet inquiries about the Ashworth estate's finances, as though preparing for a change in ownership. Higgins had also learned, through careful inquiries among the stable hands and grooms who moved between estates delivering messages and goods, that a man matching Gerald's description had been seen twice near Langley House in the weeks before Edmund arrived there, and once more near the Whitmore stables only 2 days before Cordelia's fall. The pattern was becoming clearer with every fresh piece of information. Gerald was not acting alone in some distant scheme, but was following Edmund's own movements from household to household, watching, waiting, and striking at moments calculated to look like misfortune rather than malice. Edmund asked Higgins whether Gerald might have a confederate within one of the households themselves, someone positioned to report his movements and habits, and Higgins admitted the possibility troubled him deeply, since it would mean the danger was not merely following Edmund from outside but was, perhaps, already waiting inside whichever house he entered next. It was not proof, not yet, but it was the first solid thread in a tangle of danger that had followed Edmund from household to household, and as he sat in Higgins's small lodging, with the dawn light growing stronger outside the window, he understood that his search for true love had become entangled with something far darker, a search for a man willing to harm innocent women in order to remove an obstacle between himself and a fortune he had not earned. He thought of Rosalind kneeling to help him gather scattered books, of Beatrice's raw grief in the corridor outside Cordelia's sick room, of Cordelia herself lying pale and fragile in her bed, and he made a silent promise that whatever danger Gerald Ashworth or anyone else intended, he would not stop his search now, not when the stakes had grown so much larger than his own heart, and not when 4 women he had come to know, however briefly, however imperfectly, now stood unknowingly in the path of a threat meant for him alone. A letter arrived at Fairfax Manor 3 days later, addressed to Edwin Hart, which alarmed Edmund the moment he saw it, since no one in the world should have known to send correspondence to that false name at that particular address. He opened it in the privacy of the stable loft, his hands unsteady, and found only a single line written in an unfamiliar, deliberately plain hand. "Stop asking questions you were not born to ask, or the next fall will not end in a mere sleep." He read the line 3 times, feeling the blood drain from his face. Whoever was behind the accidents now knew, with certainty, exactly who Edwin Hart really was, and had chosen to threaten him directly, rather than continue with disguised traps and near misses. The message was cruel in its precision, referencing both his true birth and the danger to Cordelia in the same breath, and it told him something important. His enemy was close enough to know his movements between 4 separate households, close enough to slip a letter into the servant's post without anyone noticing. He burned the letter in the stable lantern and told no one but Higgins, who arrived within the hour, summoned by an urgent note. The old steward's face, usually so calm and measured, had gone tight with fear. "This has gone too far," Higgins said, pacing the narrow loft. "You must abandon the disguise now, tonight, before whoever is doing this decides that threats are not enough." "If I abandon it now," Edmund said quietly, "then whoever set that cord on the Whitmore staircase wins. They frighten me back into my proper title, my proper house, and they wait for another chance, when I am not looking, when I trust the wrong servant, when I ride an unfamiliar road at night. I would rather find them, while I still have the advantage of moving unseen, among the very households they seem determined to threaten." Higgins argued, as Edmund had known he would, but in the end the old man's loyalty won out over his caution, as it always had, and he agreed to help Edmund continue, though he insisted on hiring a pair of trusted men from the village to watch the roads between the 4 estates in secret, in case another carriage wheel or another stretched cord waited somewhere ahead. It was decided that Edmund's next post would be in the household of Lady Anne Sinclair, the 4th and final candidate, whom he had met only briefly at court, and remembered mostly for her quiet reserve, so different from the sharp wit of Beatrice, or the gentle warmth of Rosalind. He arrived at Sinclair Grange 2 days later, under yet another borrowed identity, though he kept the name Edwin Hart, reasoning that changing names too often might draw more suspicion than it prevented. Sinclair Grange was smaller and plainer than the other 3 estates, with none of the ornate decoration Edmund had grown used to at Whitmore Hall, or the sprawling gardens of Fairfax Manor, and he learned quickly from the other servants that Lady Anne's father managed the estate's finances with a careful, almost stingy hand, a habit his daughter had apparently inherited, since she was known throughout the household for keeping the account books herself rather than trusting a steward, a task considered highly unusual for a woman of her station. On his second day at the Grange, Edmund was assigned to deliver correspondence to Lady Anne's study, and found her seated at a wide oak desk covered in ledgers, her sleeves pushed back, and ink staining 2 of her fingers, entirely unlike the composed and silent young woman he remembered from court. She looked up when he entered, and rather than the polite dismissal he expected, she asked him, quite directly, whether he could read figures, since the light was poor, and her eyes ached from the long columns of numbers. Surprised, Edmund admitted that he could, and found himself drawn into an hour of quiet work beside her, reading aloud rows of expenses and rents, while she checked them against her own careful calculations. She worked with a precision and focus that reminded him, oddly, of his own father in his healthier years, and she treated Edmund throughout with a plain, unaffected respect that had nothing to do with performance, since she had no reason to believe anyone of importance would ever hear of a footman helping her balance the household accounts. "You read better than most footmen I have known," Anne observed at one point, not unkindly, simply as a fact worth noting. "Were you taught?" "A kind employer once," Edmund said carefully, which was near enough to the truth, since his own tutors had shaped the education he now used to disguise himself. Anne did not press further, accepting the vague answer without suspicion, and returned to her ledgers with the same quiet focus. Edmund found himself watching her more closely than he intended, noting the small furrow of concentration between her brows, the way she murmured numbers under her breath, the careful, unhurried honesty of a woman who managed her father's estate, not for praise or recognition, but simply because it needed doing, and no one else would do it properly. That evening, as Edmund carried a stack of correspondence back toward the servants' hall, he was intercepted in a dim corridor by one of the older footmen, a stocky man named Walter, who had worked at Sinclair Grange for over a decade, and seemed to regard every new arrival with deep suspicion. Walter blocked his path without apology, and studied him with narrowed eyes. "You ask a great many questions for a man who has only just arrived," Walter said. "About the family, about the other households. I have heard you asking the stable boy about the Whitmore accident, and the Langley household before that. A footman with such curiosity makes the rest of us uneasy." Edmund's pulse quickened, though he kept his face carefully neutral. He had indeed been asking careful questions wherever he served, gathering small pieces of information that might point toward Gerald Ashworth, or reveal some other hidden enemy, but he had believed himself discreet. Walter's accusation meant either that he had grown careless, or that someone in this household was watching him more closely than he had realized, perhaps even reporting his movements to whoever had written that threatening letter. "Idle curiosity," Edmund said lightly, forcing a shrug he did not feel. "Servants gossip. I only listen." Later that same evening, Edmund found himself watching Walter with the same careful attention Walter had turned on him, curious whether the older footman's suspicions sprang from genuine loyalty to the household, or from something more troubling. He noticed that Walter often slipped away from his duties in the late afternoon, returning an hour or more later with mud on his boots that could not be explained by errands within the house. And he noticed, too, that Walter seemed unusually well informed about matters beyond the ordinary concerns of a household servant, mentioning once, in an unguarded moment, a detail about the Whitmore family's finances that no footman should reasonably have known. Edmund began to wonder whether Walter himself might be the Confederate Higgins feared, a set of eyes within Sinclair Grange reporting back to Gerald, or whoever else stood behind the campaign of accidents, though he had no proof beyond suspicion, and he knew better by now than to accuse a man without evidence strong enough to withstand scrutiny. Walter did not look convinced, but he stepped aside after a long, measuring pause, and Edmund continued on his way with his heart pounding, aware now that his safety at Sinclair Grange might be even more precarious than he had assumed. That night he wrote another coded letter to Higgins, describing Walter's suspicion and asking whether the two hired watchmen had noticed anyone unusual traveling the roads near the Grange. The answer came back 2 days later, and it was not reassuring. One of the watchmen had spotted a rider in a dark coat pausing near the edge of the Sinclair property on 2 separate nights, watching the house from a distance before riding away before he could be approached. The description was too vague to identify the man with certainty, but it confirmed what Edmund had already begun to fear. He was being followed, watched, studied in turn, by someone patient enough to wait for the perfect opportunity to strike. Despite the danger, or perhaps because of it, Edmund found himself reluctant to abandon his post at Sinclair Grange. There was something in Anne's quiet, careful honesty that drew him back to her study again the following evening, ostensibly to deliver more correspondence, though both of them understood by now that the errand was only an excuse. She asked him, this time, about his own family, and he answered with careful half-truths about a father in poor health and an estate he might one day inherit, watching her reaction closely. She did not flinch at the mention of an estate, did not lean forward with sudden interest the way he had seen other young women do when wealth entered a conversation. Instead, she simply nodded, filed the information away without comment, and asked instead whether his father's illness frightened him, a question so direct and so unexpectedly kind that Edmund found himself answering honestly for the first time in weeks, admitting that yes, it frightened him greatly, that he feared losing his father before he had become the kind of man his father hoped he would be. Anne was quiet for a long moment after that, her pen still against the ledger, and then she said simply that fear was not weakness, that her own father's failing health had taught her the same lesson, and that the only dishonor lay in letting fear stop a person from doing what needed to be done. It was such a plain, unadorned piece of wisdom, delivered without any attempt to charm or impress him, that Edmund left her study that night more shaken than he had been by any of the accidents or threats that had followed him across 4 households, because for the first time in his search, he was no longer entirely certain he was only pretending to be Edwin Hart, a man falling slowly and helplessly for a woman who did not know his true name. A scream tore through the servants' quarters at Sinclair Grange just before dawn, sharp and sudden enough to bring Edmund upright in his narrow bed, his hand already reaching for the small knife Higgins had insisted he carry. He was in the corridor within seconds, along with half a dozen other servants in various states of undress, all converging on the source of the sound, which turned out to be the young laundry maid, who had gone down to the kitchen early to start the morning fires, and had found the back door standing wide open, the lock broken clean off its fittings, and muddy boot prints leading directly toward the stairs that climbed to the family's private wing. The household erupted into chaos. Lady Anne's father, roused from sleep, demanded an immediate search of the grounds, while the housekeeper counted the silver with trembling hands to see what might have been stolen. Edmund, moving through the confusion with his heart pounding, followed the muddy boot prints himself, and found that they led not toward the silver cabinet or the study where valuables might be kept, but directly to the door of Lady Anne's private study, the very room where she kept her father's account books. The door stood ajar. Inside, the desk had been searched, ledgers pulled from their shelves and left scattered across the floor, drawers hanging open, papers strewn everywhere, as though someone had been looking for a specific document and had grown increasingly desperate when they could not find it. Nothing appeared to have been taken. Not the small amount of coin kept in the desk drawer for household expenses, not the silver letter opener that lay in plain sight. Whoever had broken in had wanted information, not money. Anne arrived moments later, wrapped in a dressing gown, her hair loose around her shoulders, and stood in the doorway surveying the wreckage of her careful work with a stillness that Edmund found more unsettling than tears would have been. She said nothing for a long moment, simply looking at the scattered papers, and then she knelt down without a word and began gathering them, sorting the pages back into their proper ledgers, with the same quiet, methodical focus he had watched her bring to every column of figures. Someone wanted to know something, she said finally, not looking up. Something they believed was written in these books. Edmund knelt beside her to help, his mind racing through every possibility. If the intruder had been searching for information rather than valuables, it strengthened his growing suspicion that Gerald Ashworth, or whoever was working with him, had reason to believe the Sinclair family's finances held some clue relevant to the Ashworth estate, some connection between the two families that Edmund himself did not yet understand. He asked, carefully, whether the Sinclair and Ashworth families had ever done business together, any loans, any shared investments, anything that might link the two names. Anne looked up at him then, surprised by the specificity of the question from a mere footman, and for a moment Edmund feared he had revealed too much of his true purpose. But she answered thoughtfully rather than suspiciously, explaining that her father had, some years ago, lent a considerable sum to a distant relation of the Ashworth family, a young man named Gerald, who had promised repayment within 2 years, and had, in fact, never repaid a single shilling of the debt. The name struck Edmund like a physical blow. Gerald Ashworth, the same cousin Higgins had identified as standing to inherit the Ashworth estate should Edmund die without an heir, was also deeply indebted to the very household Edmund now served in disguise. It was no longer a loose thread of suspicion, but a solid connection, drawn tight between two households that Edmund had believed, until this moment, to be entirely separate strands of his investigation. He excused himself as soon as he decently could and made his way to the stables, where he wrote a hurried letter to Higgins, describing the break-in, the searched ledgers, and Gerald's unpaid debt to the Sinclair family, urging his old friend to discover everything possible about Gerald's current whereabouts and his relationship to the Sinclair household. He sent the letter with one of the trusted watchmen and spent the rest of the day in a state of tense, watchful unease, helping Anne restore order to her father's accounts while keeping a careful eye on every unfamiliar face that passed through the Grange. It was nearly evening before Higgins's reply arrived, carried by the same watchman at a hard gallop. The old steward had spent the day making discreet inquiries in the county, and had learned that Gerald Ashworth had been seen only 3 days earlier at an inn less than 10 miles from Sinclair Grange, drinking heavily and speaking loudly, within earshot of the innkeeper, about debts that would soon no longer matter, and a fortune that would soon fall into his hands, whether certain relatives liked it or not. The evidence was no longer circumstantial. Gerald Ashworth, drowning in debt he had borrowed partly from the Sinclair family and had no intention of repaying, stood to inherit the entire Ashworth estate should Edmund die. and had been overheard boasting of a fortune soon to be his. Edmund read the letter twice, his hands trembling with a mixture of fear and something close to relief, the relief of finally having a clear enemy after weeks of shadowy threats and near misses. Higgins had added one further detail to his letter, gathered from a stable hand at the inn who remembered Gerald asking pointed questions about a footman named Edwin Hart, wanting to know which households the man had served in and how long he tended to stay before moving on. The question chilled Edmund more than any other piece of evidence gathered so far, since it meant Gerald was not merely aware of some vague threat to his inheritance, but was actively tracking the disguised movements Edmund had believed, until now, to be entirely his own secret. He wondered, with a fresh stab of unease, whether Walter's earlier suspicion of him had been entirely innocent curiosity after all, or whether the older footman had been asked, by Gerald or one of his agents, to watch for exactly such a man. He brought the letter to Anne that evening, unable to keep the secret from her any longer, not when her own household had been violated, and her father's careful accounts scattered across the floor by a man searching for evidence of a debt he never intended to pay. He did not reveal his true identity, not yet, but he told her, as Edwin Hart, that he had reason to believe the break-in was connected to Gerald Ashworth and his debts. Information he claimed to have gathered from careful listening among the servants of several households where he had previously worked. Anne listened with growing alarm, and when he finished, she surprised him by insisting that her father be told immediately, and that word be sent to the county magistrate about Gerald's threatening remarks at the inn. Edmund hesitated, aware that involving the magistrate risked exposing his own disguise and the elaborate scheme that had brought him to 4 different households under a false name. But Anne's insistence was firm and reasonable, and he could not, in good conscience, argue against protecting her family from a man who had already broken into their home once. The magistrate arrived the following morning, a stern, practical man named Mr. Colston, who took careful notes of the break-in and the innkeeper's overheard remarks, and promised to send word to neighboring estates, including Whitmore Hall, Langley House, and the Ashworth estate itself, warning them of a possible threat from Gerald Ashworth. Edmund stood at the edge of the room during this conversation, playing his part as a quiet footman, and felt the walls of his careful disguise beginning to close in around him, aware that word of Gerald's danger reaching the Ashworth estate itself would inevitably raise questions about why the heir himself, supposedly recovering abroad, had not yet been informed or consulted. He spent that night unable to sleep, turning over the mounting evidence against Gerald and the increasingly fragile state of his own disguise, when a soft knock came at the small window of the stable loft where he had taken to sleeping since the break-in, closer to the horses and the road, better positioned to hear any approaching danger. He opened the shutter cautiously, his knife already in hand, and found not an enemy but Anne herself, standing below in the moonlight, wrapped in a heavy cloak against the cold. "I could not sleep either," she said simply, looking up at him. "Will you walk with me? I find I think more clearly when I am moving, and there is a great deal I need to think through tonight." Edmund climbed down from the loft and fell into step beside her, along the moonlit path that wound through the Sinclair Gardens, and for the next hour they spoke, not as nobleman and disguised servant, not as suspect and investigator, but simply as 2 people frightened by the same shadow closing in around them. Anne spoke of her fear for her father's health should the danger continue, and of her own frustration at being a woman whose careful management of the household accounts had somehow made her a target in a scheme she barely understood. Edmund listened and offered what comfort he could, and found himself, more than once, on the verge of revealing his true name, the true reason for his presence in her household, the true depth of what he had come to feel for her during these strange, dangerous weeks. He held the secret back, not out of continued deception, but out of a growing fear that the truth, once spoken, might change everything between them before he had the chance to prove that his feelings, whatever they had become, were real and not merely another layer of his elaborate disguise. At one point during their walk, Anne stopped beneath an old oak near the garden wall and asked him, quite plainly, whether he had ever considered a life different from the one expected of him, a question that struck Edmund as strangely close to the truth of his own circumstances. He answered carefully, speaking in general terms of a man torn between duty to his family name and a wish to be known for himself alone, rather than for the title he would one day carry. And Anne listened with the same quiet attentiveness she brought to her father's ledgers, nodding slowly, as though his words confirmed something she had already suspected about him, without knowing quite why. She confessed, in turn, that she sometimes resented the assumption that her only value to her family lay in whichever marriage she might eventually make, when she had spent years proving herself capable of managing an entire estate's finances, with a skill her own father openly admitted he lacked. They walked until the eastern sky began to lighten, and parted at the garden gate with nothing resolved except a shared, unspoken understanding that whatever came next, they would face it together, whether as footman and lady, or as something neither of them had yet found the courage to name. A rider came thundering up the drive of Sinclair Grange just after breakfast, his horse blowing hard, and the man nearly fell from the saddle in his haste to deliver a message to the house. Edmund recognized him at once as one of Higgins's trusted watchmen, and the sight of the man's grim, urgent face told him something had gone badly wrong before a single word was spoken. "Lord Ashworth has taken a turn," the watchman gasped, addressing the housekeeper who had come running at the commotion, though his eyes found Edmund across the courtyard and held there with unmistakable meaning. "The old lord is failing fast. His physician does not expect him to see another week." Edmund felt the ground shift beneath him. His father, whom he had left months earlier under the pretense of recovering from a hunting accident abroad, was truly dying now, and Edmund had spent the morning of that terrible news disguised as a footman in a household 3 counties away, chasing shadows and threats instead of sitting at his father's bedside where he belonged. Every argument he had made to himself about the importance of his search, every justification for the danger he had invited into 4 innocent households, crumbled in an instant against the simple, terrible fact that his father might die without ever seeing his son again. He requested leave from his duties immediately, claiming a family emergency of his own, and found Higgins waiting for him at the edge of the property, with 2 fast horses already saddled. The old steward's face was drawn and pale, and he did not waste time on explanations before they were both riding hard toward the Ashworth estate, leaving behind Sinclair Grange, the broken lock on the study door, and Anne's quiet, worried eyes, without a proper farewell. They rode through the day and into the night, stopping only to change horses at coaching inns along the way, and Edmund's mind during those long hours in the saddle was a storm of fear and guilt and grief he had not allowed himself to feel until now. He thought of his father, as he had last seen him, thin and pale but still sharp of mind, still capable of a stern lecture about duty and legacy, still hopeful, despite his failing heart, that he might live to see his son married and settled before the end came. Edmund had told himself, all these weeks, that his disguise was a form of duty, a careful search for the right woman to carry on the family name his father cared so deeply about. But riding through the dark countryside toward a deathbed he might not reach in time, the whole scheme felt suddenly reckless and selfish, a young man's game played while his father's life slipped away unattended. They reached the Ashworth estate 2 days later, exhausted and filthy from the road, and Edmund abandoned all pretense of disguise the moment he crossed the threshold, striding through the halls in his plain footman's clothes with an authority that made the household staff stare in confusion, since they knew this man as a stranger, yet he moved through the corridors as though he owned every stone of the place, which of course he did. His father was awake when Edmund entered the sick room, propped up against a mountain of pillows, his face gray and sunken, but his eyes still bright with recognition. "You came back looking like a common laborer," the old lord said, his voice thin but not without humor, "and smelling a good deal worse. Your recovery abroad must have been a strange one indeed." Edmund knelt beside the bed and, for the first time since he had begun his elaborate scheme, told his father the entire truth, the disguise, the 4 households, the accidents that had followed him from Whitmore Hall to Langley House, to Fairfax Manor, to Sinclair Grange, and finally the mounting evidence pointing toward Gerald Ashworth as the man behind it all. He expected anger, or at the very least, stern disappointment, but his father listened in silence, his thin hand tightening slowly around Edmund's own, and when Edmund finished, the old lord surprised him by laughing, a weak, rasping sound that turned quickly into a cough. "I did the same thing myself," his father admitted once he had recovered his breath, "though I never told your mother the whole of it. I worked 3 months in her father's stables before I ever asked for her hand, and I learned more of her true character mucking out horse stalls than I ever learned in a single ballroom. I only wish I had told you sooner, so you might have known you were not so very foolish after all." His father went on, his voice growing weaker but his eyes bright with the memory, describing how he had first seen Edmund's mother not across a crowded ballroom, but bent over a wounded mare in the Sinclair family's own stables, years before Edmund was born, tending the animal with a gentleness that no fine gown or powdered hair could have taught her. He had known within a fortnight of quiet, disguised service that he would marry her if she would have him, and he confessed, now, with a rueful smile, that his own father had been furious at the deception when it finally came to light, threatening for a full season to disown him entirely, before relenting, once he saw how happy the marriage had made his son. "Every generation believes its own foolishness is unique," the old lord said, his breath rattling faintly in his chest. "It rarely is. But sometimes, the foolishness is worth the cost, and I have never once regretted mine." The revelation stunned Edmund into silence. This sudden discovery that his own father had walked nearly the same path decades earlier, and it eased some of the guilt that had weighed on him through 2 days of hard riding. But his father's expression grew serious again quickly, the brief warmth of the memory giving way to real concern, as Edmund described the evidence against Gerald. "That boy was always trouble," his father said grimly. "His debts are worse than you know. I have had my own solicitor watching his affairs for months. Ever since he came to me last spring, asking for a loan I refused to give him. If he has truly grown desperate enough to threaten innocent women in an attempt to see you removed from the line of succession, then he is more dangerous than I ever believed possible, and we must act before he grows any bolder." Edmund also sent a rider that same night to Sinclair Grange, asking discreetly after Walter's history and whether the older footman had ever been seen in Gerald's company, and the answer that returned 2 days later confirmed his growing suspicion. Walter had indeed once served briefly in a household connected to Gerald's mother's side of the family, a connection distant enough to have escaped notice during his hiring at Sinclair Grange, but close enough to explain his unusual knowledge of matters beyond a footman's ordinary concern. It was not proof of active conspiracy, but it was one more thread pulled taut in a web that seemed to grow more tangled the more Edmund examined it. That same night, with his father too weak to leave his bed, but sharp enough to direct the effort from his pillows, Edmund and Higgins began assembling everything they knew. The threatening letter, the innkeeper's overheard boasts, the searched ledgers at Sinclair Grange, the unpaid debt owed to Anne's father, and the pattern of accidents that had followed Edmund from household to household. Lord Ashworth insisted that his own solicitor be brought in immediately to compile the evidence into a formal complaint that could be presented to the county magistrate, the same Mr. Colston who had already begun investigating on behalf of the Sinclair family. But even as the household mobilized against Gerald, a new and troubling thought occurred to Edmund as he sat beside his father's bed in the small hours of the morning. If Gerald had grown desperate enough to break into Sinclair Grange searching for evidence of his debt, and if he had learned, through whatever network of spies had been watching Edmund's movements, that the true heir to the Ashworth fortune had now abandoned his disguise and returned home to a dying father, then Gerald's most dangerous moment might still lie ahead of them. A man with nothing left to lose, facing the collapse of his entire scheme, might act with far greater recklessness than he had shown in his careful, deniable accidents thus far. Edmund voiced this fear to his father, who nodded slowly, his gray face grave in the candlelight. "Then we must not wait for him to act first," the old lord said. "Send word to the magistrate tonight, and send word, too, to those 4 households you have deceived these many weeks. They deserve to know the danger that has followed you into their homes, whatever they may think of you once they learn the truth of who you truly are." It was, Edmund knew, sound advice, but it filled him with a fresh and different kind of dread. The fear not of Gerald's violence but of the moment, fast approaching now, when Cordelia and Beatrice and Rosalind and Anne would each learn that the quiet footman they had known as Edwin Hart was, in truth, the very nobleman their families hoped they might marry, and that his search among their households had been built, from the very first day, upon a foundation of careful, deliberate deception. The letters went out before dawn, 4 of them, each sealed with the Ashworth crest, and carried by riders who did not stop to rest until they reached Whitmore Hall, Langley House, Fairfax Manor, and Sinclair Grange in turn. Edmund had spent the better part of the night composing them, tearing up draft after draft, unable to find words that could soften a truth this large. In the end he had written each letter plainly, admitting to his disguise, explaining the danger from Gerald Ashworth that had followed him into their homes, and asking, with as much humility as he could manage, for the chance to explain himself in person once his father's health allowed him to travel. He did not know how any of them would receive the news, and the waiting proved harder than any of the physical dangers he had faced over the previous weeks. He remained at his father's bedside through the following days, torn between his duty to a dying man and his desperate need to know whether Anne, in particular, would ever speak to him again once she understood the full extent of his deception. Word came back first, from Whitmore Hall, where Cordelia had recovered enough from her fall to sit up and receive visitors, though she remained weak and easily tired. Her reply, delivered by the same rider who had carried Edmund's letter, was shorter than he expected and colder than he had feared. She wrote that she understood the necessity of caution, given the danger to his life, but that she found the deception itself difficult to forgive, since she had treated a man she believed to be a common footman with no particular warmth, and now understood that her ordinary behavior toward the staff of her own household had been observed and judged by a nobleman in disguise. She asked, pointedly, whether he had enjoyed watching her fail the test he had secretly set for her. He read the words 3 times over, feeling each one land with the precision of a well-aimed blow, and found himself pacing the length of his father's study, long into the night, turning her question over in his mind. Had he enjoyed it, watching her fail a test she never knew she was taking? He did not think so, not truly, but he could not entirely deny that some part of his early observations had carried the cold satisfaction of a man, confirming a suspicion he had carried into her household from the very first day. That admission, however small, troubled him more than her anger did. The letter stung, though Edmund could not entirely fault her anger. He had judged her, in his private observations, for her coldness toward the servants, and now she understood that judgment had taken place, and resented it deeply. He wrote back an honest apology, admitting that his search had been unfair in its secrecy, and received no further reply, a silence that told him plainly enough where matters stood between them. Beatrice's response arrived 2 days later, and proved sharper still, though laced with the dark humor Edmund had come to associate with her. She wrote that she ought to have suspected something the moment a mere footman had appeared so unaccountably well-spoken in the corridor outside Cordelia's sick room, and that her own sharp mind, of which she was quite proud, had been thoroughly humiliated by failing to see through so elaborate a scheme. She was not, she wrote, entirely opposed to forgiving him, provided he could explain himself well enough at their next meeting to satisfy her considerable capacity for skepticism, but she made it clear that any future consideration of his hand would depend entirely on that conversation, and not on his title or his fortune, which she cared for not at all. Rosalind's letter, when it came, was gentler than either of the first 2, though no less troubled. She wrote that she had always sensed something unusual in the quiet footman who helped her gather scattered books, some quality of thoughtfulness that seemed out of place in a servant's role, and that she was more sorrowful than angry to learn the truth, since she had genuinely enjoyed the small kindnesses they had exchanged, and now wondered whether any of it had been real or merely part of his elaborate test. She asked, with a vulnerability that touched Edmund deeply, whether he had ever truly seen her as a person, or only as a subject to be studied and judged, alongside 3 other women competing for the same prize. He wrote back to her at length, describing honestly the small moments that had shaped his growing regard for her, the afternoons spent gathering scattered books, her habit of remembering the names and troubles of every servant in her household, the quiet dignity with which she bore her mother's restrictions, without ever losing her own curious, generous spirit. He told her plainly that his search had never been about ranking 4 women against one another like horses at auction, however much the scheme's design might have suggested otherwise, but about learning to see past the performances noble courtship demanded, and to recognize genuine character wherever it appeared. Whether the letter eased her sorrow, he could not be certain, since her reply, when it eventually came weeks later, spoke of forgiveness without quite promising anything more. A careful, guarded kindness that left the door open without inviting him fully back through it. It was Anne's letter that Edmund waited for with the greatest dread, and it did not arrive at all during the first week, nor the second, a silence that felt far heavier than any angry words could have been. He wrote to her twice more, receiving no reply either time, and began to fear that his deception, however well-intentioned, had done irreparable damage to the fragile trust that had grown between them during those quiet evenings in her study, and that final moonlit walk through the Sinclair gardens. His father's condition, meanwhile, continued its slow decline, though the old lord clung stubbornly to life, with a determination that both worried and heartened his son. Lord Ashworth insisted on being kept informed of every development in the investigation against Gerald, and it was during one of these bedside conversations that word finally arrived from the county magistrate, Mr. Colston, that Gerald Ashworth had been located at a coaching inn 2 counties away, drinking heavily and spending money he did not have, apparently unaware that the evidence against him had grown strong enough to warrant his arrest. Colston sent word ahead to Sinclair Grange as well, and it was there, during the arrest, that Walter's connection to Gerald was finally confirmed beyond doubt, since the older footman was found to have been receiving small payments for reporting Edmund's movements and habits, funneled through a chain of intermediaries clever enough to have avoided detection until Gerald himself, cornered and desperate, named every person who had assisted him in exchange for a slightly lighter accounting of his own crimes. Walter was dismissed from service immediately and faced his own separate questioning before the magistrate, though his role, being one of information rather than direct violence, earned him a far lesser punishment than the one awaiting Gerald. Colston's men moved quickly, and Gerald was taken into custody without incident, protesting his innocence loudly enough that half the inn's patrons later testified to having heard him confess, in his drunken state, to arranging the accidents meant to frighten Edmund away from his search, though he denied, even under questioning, any intention of causing serious harm, insisting the traps had been meant only to warn, not to kill. Whether this was true or merely a desperate man's attempt to lessen his punishment, Edmund could not say with certainty, but the danger, at least, appeared to be at an end. He should have felt relief at the news, and in part he did, the tight coil of fear that had lived in his chest for weeks finally beginning to loosen. But the victory felt hollow measured against the silence from Sinclair Grange, and against Cordelia's cold anger, and Rosalind's quiet sorrow, and even Beatrice's guarded skepticism. He had set out, months earlier, to find true love by stripping away the performances of noble courtship, and instead, he had built an even larger performance of his own, one that had cost him the trust of every woman he had come to know, and possibly the one whose honesty had come to mean more to him than he had ever expected. His father, watching his son's troubled face across the sick room, spoke with the blunt wisdom of a man who no longer had the strength or the patience for gentle evasions. "You cannot mend what is broken by sitting at my bedside and staring at the wall, Edmund. Gerald is caught. The danger has passed. Whatever chance you have left with any of these women, you will not find it in this room. Go to her, whichever her it is that has put that particular look on your face, and tell her the truth plainly, without excuses, and let her decide for herself what your heart is worth." It was, Edmund knew, exactly the push he needed, and exactly the risk he had been too afraid to take. He kissed his father's thin hand, promised to return within the week whatever the outcome, and rode out that same afternoon toward Sinclair Grange, uncertain whether he would find forgiveness waiting for him, or only the closed door of a woman who had trusted a footman named Edwin Hart, and now had every reason to distrust the nobleman who had worn that name as a mask. The gates of Sinclair Grange stood closed when Edmund arrived, and the servant who answered his knock, a young footman he did not recognize, informed him with obvious discomfort that Lady Anne had left instructions she would receive no visitors from the Ashworth family. Edmund stood on the drive for a long moment, the rejection landing harder than he had expected, even though he had braced himself for exactly this outcome. And he was on the verge of turning his horse back toward the road when Anne's father appeared in the doorway behind the footman, his expression unreadable. "You have caused a great deal of trouble in my household, Lord Ashworth," the older man said, using Edmund's true title for the first time, and the formality of it felt like a wall being raised between them. "A broken lock, scattered ledgers, a debt from your own cousin that nearly ruined my finances, and a footman who turned out to be neither a footman nor entirely honest about his purpose in my house. Give me one reason why I should let you pass this door." Edmund had prepared many arguments during the long ride from his father's estate, but standing now before Anne's father, all of them felt inadequate, and he found himself falling back on nothing more than the plain truth. "I can give you no good reason, sir," he said. "I deceived your household, and I deceived your daughter, for reasons that seemed sound to me at the time. and seem increasingly foolish the longer I consider them. I do not ask you to forgive the deception. I ask only for the chance to speak with Lady Anne directly, so that whatever she decides with full knowledge of the truth, rather than through a closed door and a servant's refusal." The older man studied him for a long, silent moment, and something in his weathered face softened slightly, though his voice remained stern. "My daughter has not left her study in 3 days, except to sleep," he said finally. "She has said almost nothing to me about the matter, which is unlike her, since she has never in her life hidden her opinions from me when asked. Whatever you did to her, Lord Ashworth, it has wounded her more deeply than her cold manner would suggest. I will allow you into the garden, no further, and I will send her word that you are here. What she chooses to do with that information is entirely her own affair, and I will not press her either way." Edmund waited in the garden for nearly an hour, pacing the same gravel path where he and Anne had walked together in the moonlight weeks earlier, and he had very nearly convinced himself that she would not come at all when he finally heard the soft crunch of footsteps on the path behind him. He turned to find her standing a short distance away, her arms crossed against the evening chill, her face composed into the same careful stillness he remembered from their very first meeting, though her eyes, when they met his, held none of the warmth that had grown between them over their weeks of quiet conversation. "You have a great deal of nerve, showing your face in this garden," she said, and though her voice was steady, Edmund could hear the effort it cost her to keep it that way. "I have no defense for what I did," Edmund said, deciding immediately that excuses would only make matters worse. "I set out to learn the true character of 4 women my father hoped I might marry, and I told myself the deception was necessary, that noble courtship had made honesty impossible any other way. I still believe there was some truth in that reasoning, but I did not consider, until it was far too late, what the deception would cost the people I deceived, and I did not consider, until I sat at my father's deathbed and realized I might lose him, without ever telling him the truth of my own heart, how much I had come to care for you specifically, not as one of 4 candidates in an experiment, but as Anne, the woman who knelt on her study floor to gather scattered ledgers rather than simply order a servant to do it, who asked whether her father's illness frightened me, and listened to my honest answer without flinching." Anne was silent for a long moment, her arms still crossed, her gaze fixed somewhere past his shoulder rather than meeting his eyes directly. "You watched me," she said finally, her voice tight. "Every conversation we had, every evening in my study, you were watching me, judging whether I was worthy of your hand, while I believed I was simply speaking honestly with a footman I had come to trust. Do you understand what that means, Lord Ashworth? Every kindness I showed you, every private thought I confided, was given freely to a man I believed had no power over my life, and instead it was given to the very man whose approval would determine whether my family gained or lost a valuable alliance. You took something honest from me and turned it, without my knowledge, into an audition." The accusation landed hard, and Edmund could not honestly deny the truth of it, however much it pained him to hear. "You are right," he said quietly. "I cannot undo that. I can only tell you that whatever judgment I made of your character was never the cold calculation you fear it was. I did not fall for you because you passed some test of noble manners. I fell for you because you were honest with a person you believed could offer you nothing, because you managed your father's accounts not for praise but simply because it was right, because you knelt on a study floor without a moment's hesitation to help a clumsy footman gather his scattered books. None of that was performed for my benefit, Anne, and that is precisely why it moved me more than every ballroom conversation I have ever had with a woman who knew exactly which nobleman she was trying to impress." Anne's composure cracked slightly at this, her arms loosening from across her chest, though she did not step closer. "And what am I meant to do with that, now that I know the truth?" she asked, her voice quieter now, less certain. "Trust a man who lied to me for weeks, because he says the lie does not change what he felt underneath it? How am I to know where the performance ends and the man begins, when I have already been proven wrong once about which was which?" She was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke again her voice had lost some of its earlier hardness, replaced by something more tired and more honest. "My father tells me Walter was found to have been paid for reports of your movements," she said. "He was in this very house, watching you, watching me, for weeks, and I never once suspected him, a man I had trusted since I was a girl of 12. If I could not see the danger sitting at my own table, Edmund, how am I meant to trust my own judgment now? About you, or about anyone? It was a fair question, and Edmund had no clever answer ready. Only the plain, unpolished truth. You cannot know. Not with certainty. Not yet, he admitted. I can only ask you to give me the chance to prove it slowly, honestly, without any further disguise between us, and to judge me now not by the deception of these past weeks, but by whatever comes next. I am not asking you to forgive me tonight, Anne. I am asking you not to close the door entirely, so that I might have the chance to earn back, honestly this time, whatever trust I broke by deceiving you in the first place. She studied him for a long moment in the fading evening light, her expression unreadable, and then, without answering him directly, she turned and walked back toward the house, leaving Edmund alone in the garden, uncertain whether her silence meant refusal, or simply a need for more time than he had any right to demand of her. Word reached Edmund 3 days later, while he sat once again at his father's bedside, that Gerald Ashworth had escaped custody during transport to the county courthouse, overpowering a single careless guard and vanishing into the countryside before a proper search could be organized. The news struck the household like a physical blow, since everyone had believed the danger safely contained, and Edmund felt the old, familiar fear return in full force. Sharper now, because he understood better than before exactly how far his cousin was willing to go to secure the fortune he believed should have been his. His father, weaker now than he had been even a week earlier, gripped Edmund's hand with surprising strength when the news was delivered. "He will come here," the old lord said, his voice a rasping whisper. "A desperate man returns to the source of his grievance. You must prepare the household, and you must warn the others, all of them, wherever Gerald might believe he can still cause harm." The burrito was cold. Edmund spent that night organizing what defense he could, sending riders to warn Whitmore Hall, Langley House, Fairfax Manor, and Sinclair Grange that Gerald remained at large and might attempt some final, desperate act against any of the households connected to his scheme. He requested that the county magistrate assign watchmen to each estate, and Mr. Colston, to his credit, complied swiftly, though he warned that a man with nothing left to lose might slip past even careful precautions if he was determined enough. The blow fell 4 days later, not at the Ashworth estate as Edmund's father had predicted, but at Sinclair Grange, where Gerald had apparently learned, through some remaining thread of his network of spies, that Anne's father held documentation of the unpaid debt that had first drawn Colston's investigation into Gerald's finances. Late in the evening, as the household settled for the night, a fire broke out in the study, where Anne kept her father's ledgers, spreading quickly through papers and dry wood before anyone raised the alarm. Edmund was 2 hours' ride away when word reached him, delivered by an exhausted rider who had nearly killed his horse getting the message through, and he did not wait for a fresh mount or a proper escort before setting out at a dangerous gallop through the dark countryside, his mind consumed with a single, terrible fear that Anne herself might have been caught in the study when the fire started, searching, as she so often did in the evenings, through her father's careful records. He arrived at Sinclair Grange to find the study reduced to blackened ruin, smoke still curling from the collapsed roof, and the household gathered in the courtyard in various states of shock and exhaustion. His heart nearly stopped until he spotted Anne among them, wrapped in a blanket, her face streaked with soot but otherwise unharmed, and the relief that flooded through him was so overwhelming, he very nearly embraced her before remembering, with painful clarity, the uncertain state of things left unresolved between them in the garden 3 days earlier. "I was not in the room," Anne said, seeing the fear in his face and answering the question before he could ask it. "A watchman spotted smoke and raised the alarm before the fire truly took hold. We lost most of the ledgers, but no one was hurt." She paused, studying him with an expression Edmund could not quite read. The watchman also caught sight of a man fleeing across the eastern field, tall, dark-coated, moving with the gait of someone who knew the grounds well enough to avoid the worst of the mud. Gerald. It could be no one else. And the boldness of the attack, striking directly at the household holding evidence against him, rather than fleeing further from justice, told Edmund that his cousin's desperation had crossed into something more dangerous than mere self-preservation. A man burning down a study to destroy evidence of his debts was a man who believed he had nothing left to lose. And such men, Edmund knew from bitter experience over the past weeks, were capable of far worse before they were finally stopped. Anne insisted on joining the initial organization of the search despite her father's objections, arguing with the same calm precision she brought to her ledgers, that she knew the estate's boundaries and hidden corners better than any hired watchman, having walked every field and hedgerow since childhood. She marked out the search zones on a rough map spread across a surviving table in the courtyard, dividing the grounds into sections and assigning riders to each, with brisk, capable authority that reminded Edmund, not for the first time, of exactly why he had fallen for her in the first place. It was Anne's map, in the end, that sent Edmund toward the eastern field, rather than the western road most of the other riders favored. Her memory of an old, rarely used gamekeeper's path, guiding him toward the one hiding place a stranger to the estate would never have thought to search. The watchman organized a search of the surrounding countryside that stretched through the remainder of the night, and it was Edmund himself, riding the eastern field where the fleeing man had last been seen, who spotted a faint light flickering in the old gamekeeper's cottage, long abandoned since the previous keeper's retirement 2 years earlier. He approached carefully, dismounting well before he reached the cottage, and creeping the final distance on foot, and through a gap in the shuttered window, he saw Gerald Ashworth himself, disheveled and wild-eyed, pacing before a small fire, muttering to himself about debts and fortunes, and a cousin who should have died on that broken bridge months earlier, if the driver had simply let the carriage fall. Edmund's blood ran cold at the confirmation, spoken aloud in Gerald's own desperate voice, that the carriage accident on the stone bridge had been no accident at all, the very first attempt in a long campaign of violence that had followed him across 4 households and had very nearly claimed multiple innocent lives along the way. He backed away from the window carefully, intending to return to the search party with news of Gerald's location rather than risk a confrontation alone. But a dry branch snapped beneath his boot in the darkness, and before he could retreat further, the cottage door burst open, and Gerald stood in the doorway, firelight behind him, a hunting knife gleaming in his unsteady hand. "You," Gerald spat, staring at Edmund with an expression that mixed hatred and something close to despair. "Even now, even after everything, you cannot simply let me have what should have been mine. You were always the favored son, the golden heir, while I was left to scrape by on a smaller inheritance and watch you inherit everything simply because you were born a few years earlier and to the right branch of the family." "You speak of favor as though I ever asked for it," Edmund said, forcing his voice to remain level despite the knife glinting in the firelight between them. "I never asked to be born the elder branch, Gerald, and I never once looked down on you for your circumstances. If you had come to me honestly, years ago, and told me of your debts, I would have helped you. My father offered you help, and you refused it out of pride, and now that pride has led you to burn down a woman's study and threaten a household that never wronged you." "Words," Gerald spat, though his hand trembled further, the knife dipping slightly as exhaustion and desperation warred visibly across his haggard face. "Easy words, from a man who has never once gone to bed wondering how he would pay his creditors, never once watched lesser men inherit fortunes, simply for being born in the right year to the right father." "None of what you have done can be undone by more violence, Gerald," Edmund said carefully, keeping his voice steady, though his heart hammered against his ribs. "You have already been caught once. Running further, hurting more people, will only make your punishment worse when you are caught again. And you will be caught, Gerald. The magistrate has evidence enough to hang you twice over already." Gerald's hand trembled around the knife, and for a long, terrible moment, Edmund believed his cousin might lunge forward, despite the hopelessness of his position, driven past reason by weeks of desperation and drink and the collapse of every scheme he had built. But then, from behind Edmund, came the sound of approaching horses and raised voices, the search party finally closing in on the light of the cottage fire, and Gerald's shoulders sagged as the last of his resolve seemed to drain away all at once. He dropped the knife into the mud at his feet and sank down onto the cottage doorstep, all the fight gone out of him, and offered no resistance at all when the watchman arrived moments later to take him into custody for the second and final time. The county courthouse was crowded on the morning of Gerald's trial, word of the strange and dangerous scheme having spread through every noble household within riding distance, and Edmund found himself seated in the front row beside his father, who had insisted on being carried from his sickbed in a covered chair, rather than miss the proceedings that would finally close this chapter of danger and deception. The old lord's health had stabilized somewhat in the weeks since Gerald's second capture, as though the resolution of the threat against his son had given him a reason to fight a little longer against his failing heart. Edmund glanced around the courtroom as the proceedings began and felt his chest tighten at the sight of familiar faces scattered among the crowd. Cordelia sat near the back, still pale from her recovery, but upright and alert, her expression guarded whenever her eyes met Edmund's across the room. Beatrice sat closer to the front, arms crossed in her characteristic manner, watching the proceedings with the same sharp attention she brought to everything. Rosalind sat beside her mother, her gentle face troubled, and when she caught Edmund's gaze, she offered a small, uncertain smile that he could not quite interpret. Anne was not present, and her absence weighed on Edmund more heavily than he expected, a fresh reminder that whatever chance remained for them had not yet been resolved, and might never be resolved, if the events of the fire and Gerald's escape had hardened her heart further against him, rather than softening it. The trial itself moved swiftly, the evidence against Gerald overwhelming and largely uncontested. Witnesses described the innkeeper's overheard boasts, the cord found at Whitmore Hall, the rope in the Fairfax stables, the searched ledgers, and eventual fire at Sinclair Grange, and finally Gerald's own confession, muttered in his desperation at the gamekeeper's cottage, and confirmed under formal questioning, once he understood the futility of further denial. The magistrate, Mr. Colston, presented the case with the same careful precision he had shown throughout the investigation, and by the time the judge retired to consider the verdict, there was little doubt in the courtroom about how the matter would end. Walter, too, faced judgment that same week, though his sentence proved far lighter than Gerald's, since the court accepted his claim that he had believed himself merely reporting harmless gossip in exchange for coin, without full knowledge of the violence such reports would eventually enable. He was dismissed from all future service in noble households, a punishment severe enough in its own way, for a man who had spent his whole working life in service, and Edmund felt no particular satisfaction watching the older footman led from the courtroom, only a tired sort of pity, for a man whose greed had cost him everything he had spent decades building. Gerald was found guilty on every count, his debts and desperation laid bare before the assembled nobility of the county, and sentenced to transportation for a term of years, a punishment that spared his life, but ensured he would trouble the Ashworth family no further, for a very long time. Edmund watched his cousin led away in chains, and felt not triumph but a kind of weary sorrow, understanding better than most in that courtroom how easily ordinary grievances, left to fester unaddressed, could curdle into something monstrous. Outside the courthouse, as the crowd dispersed into the afternoon sunlight, Edmund found himself approached in turn by each of the three women whose households he had disrupted with his elaborate disguise. Cordelia was the first, her manner still cool but softened somewhat by the weeks since her injury. "I have had a great deal of time to think, lying in my bed these past weeks," she said, "about the way I treated the servants in my own household, and about the footman who watched me do it. I do not forgive the deception easily, Lord Ashworth, but I confess your test taught me something true about myself that I might never have learned otherwise, and for that, at least, I find I cannot entirely resent you." She offered a small formal curtsy and took her leave, and Edmund understood that whatever chance had once existed between them had ended not in bitterness, but in a kind of mutual, respectful distance. Beatrice approached next, her sharp eyes studying him with characteristic directness. "I have decided to forgive you," she announced without preamble, though only because Cordelia would not have survived her fall at all, had you not ridden through the night to check on her, disguise or no disguise. That counts for something in my accounting, even if the rest of your scheme was foolish beyond measure." She paused, and a rare softness entered her expression. "I do not think I am the woman you are searching for, Lord Ashworth, whatever my family might hope, but I think you already know that, and I think you have known it for some time now." Edmund could only nod, grateful for her characteristic honesty even in this awkward parting, and Beatrice took her leave with a brisk nod of her own, already moving to rejoin Cordelia, whose friendship had clearly deepened rather than frayed through the shared ordeal of the past weeks. Rosalind lingered longest, her gentle face still troubled as she searched for words. "I do not think less of you for the deception," she said finally, her voice soft. "I think, perhaps, I understand it better than the others, since I have spent my whole life being watched and judged by my mother's careful eye, wondering always whether my kindness was truly mine, or simply what was expected of me. I believe your search was born of the same loneliness, Lord Ashworth, the same wish to be seen truly, rather than performed for. She smiled, small and sad. But I do not think your heart settled on me during those weeks, however kind we were to each other. I think we both already know where it settled, and I hope, whatever happens next, that she has the wisdom to see what I see so clearly. His father, wheeled out into the afternoon sunlight by a careful attendant, watched this final exchange from a distance and beckoned Edmund over, once Rosalind had gone. "You have the look of a man who has finally stopped running from something," the old lord said, studying his son's face with tired but perceptive eyes. "I take it the courthouse yard has taught you more than the trial itself managed to." Edmund could only nod, and his father allowed himself a small, satisfied smile, before instructing his attendant to wheel him back toward the waiting carriage, content, it seemed, to let his son find his own way toward the conversation still waiting to be had. She left before Edmund could find an adequate response, and he stood alone in the courthouse yard for a long moment, watching the crowd thin around him, the weight of Rosalind's gentle perception settling over him with a mixture of embarrassment and relief. She was right, of course, and had been generous enough to say so plainly, rather than force him to admit it himself. His search, which had begun as an attempt to know 4 women equally and fairly, had ended, somewhere along the dangerous road of the past months, in a heart given entirely to one, and the only question left unresolved was whether that heart would be accepted or refused. Edmund rode for Sinclair Grange the very next morning, unwilling to wait a single additional day, now that Gerald's trial had closed the last outstanding danger hanging over the 4 households, and unwilling, too, to let Rosalind's gentle words fade into the kind of comfortable delay that might cost him his last real chance at happiness. He arrived to find the study still under repair, workmen replacing charred beams and scorched flooring, and Anne's father directing the effort from the doorway, with the same careful precision his daughter brought to her ledgers. The older man saw Edmund approaching and, to his surprise, did not turn him away this time. "She is in the garden," he said simply, gesturing toward the path that wound past the roses. "I will not pretend to know what she intends to say to you, Lord Ashworth, but I have watched my daughter these past weeks, and I have never seen her so unlike herself, quiet and troubled in a way that has nothing to do with a fire, or a debt, or a cousin's madness. Whatever you intend to say to her, I suggest you say it honestly, and say it soon, before either of you loses the courage for it entirely." Edmund found her exactly where he had left her weeks earlier, standing near the same stretch of gravel path, though this time she did not cross her arms defensively when she saw him approaching. She simply watched him come, her expression unreadable, and waited. Anne studied him for a long moment before either of them spoke, the late afternoon light catching the last traces of soot still faintly visible near the rebuilt window frame behind her, a quiet reminder of everything they had survived together to reach this moment. "You came quickly," she said finally, and there was no accusation in it this time, only a simple observation. "I did not want to lose another day to caution," Edmund answered. "I have lost enough already through caution and disguise, and every careful calculation I told myself was necessary. I would rather risk saying too much too soon than risk losing you through silence again." "I do not have a clever speech prepared," Edmund said, stopping a respectful distance away. "I have learned, over these past months, that clever speeches and careful performances are precisely what I set out to escape, and I would rather stand here and tell you plainly what is true, even if it is clumsy in the telling. I love you, Anne. Not the idea of you, not some careful judgment reached after comparing 4 candidates against each other, but you specifically, your honesty, your quiet strength, the way you knelt on a study floor without a moment's hesitation to help a servant you believed had nothing to offer you in return. I have loved you since long before I understood what the feeling was, and I very nearly lost the chance to tell you so, first through my own foolish deception, and then through a fire that might have taken you from me entirely, before I ever found the courage to speak honestly." Anne was silent for a long moment, her eyes bright in the afternoon light, and when she finally spoke, her voice trembled slightly, despite her evident effort to keep it steady. "I have spent 3 weeks trying to decide whether I could ever trust a man who lied to me so completely," she said, "and I have come to understand something during that time, something I do not think I would have understood without the anger and the hurt forcing me to examine it honestly. The man I fell for in my study, reading figures aloud beside me, walking with me through this very garden in the middle of the night, was not a performance, Edmund. I know that now, because a performance would not have ridden through the night to Whitmore Hall out of simple worry for a woman he barely knew, and a performance would not have looked so genuinely afraid when he thought I might have been caught in that fire. The name was false. The man beneath it, I have come to believe, was always true. Edmund closed the distance between them then, scarcely daring to hope, and Anne did not step back this time, did not cross her arms against him, but instead reached out and took his hand in both of hers, the same careful, deliberate gesture she brought to everything she valued. "I will not pretend the hurt is entirely gone," she said, looking up at him. "I do not think it will fully disappear for some time yet, but I find I would rather spend that time learning to trust you honestly, without any disguise standing between us, than spend it alone, wondering what might have been. If you are asking what I believe you are asking, Edmund Ashworth, then my answer is yes, though I reserve the right to remind you of this deception every time you grow too pleased with yourself in the years ahead." Edmund laughed, a sound of pure relief and joy that had been building in his chest since the moment he first cracked a carriage wheel on a stone bridge and set out to find the truth of 4 women's hearts, never imagining that the search would nearly cost him his life, would cost him the easy trust of 3 good women along the way, and would end, finally, in a garden with the 4th, the quiet, honest woman who had never once performed for him, because she had never known there was anyone worth performing for. They were married the following spring, in a small ceremony, attended by Edmund's father, who lived long enough to see his son settled after all. Propped up in a chair near the front of the chapel, with tears of undisguised joy on his weathered face. Cordelia and Beatrice attended together, seated side by side as the close friends their shared ordeal had made them, and Rosalind sent a gift and a warm letter from Fairfax Manor, wishing them both the same honest happiness she had seen so clearly waiting for them, long before either of them had been ready to claim it. In the years that followed, Edmund would sometimes tell the story of how he had disguised himself as a footman to find true love, and listeners would laugh at the strangeness of it, the danger and the deception, and the cousin who had nearly destroyed everything out of jealousy and debt. Cordelia married 2 years later, a match of her own choosing rather than her family's arrangement, and household staff who later entered her service would remark, with some surprise, on the particular kindness she showed to every servant in her care, a change she herself credited, when pressed by curious friends, to a lesson learned the hard way during a strange season, when a footman had watched her more closely than she ever realized. Beatrice never married at all, choosing instead to manage her own considerable inheritance with the same sharp, capable mind she had always possessed, and she remained a close friend to both Edmund and Anne for the whole of her long life, visiting often enough that her wit became a fixture of holidays at the Ashworth estate. Rosalind, in time, found a match of her own with a young scholar who valued her curiosity rather than trying to contain it, and she wrote to Anne for years afterward, the 2 women having formed, out of the wreckage of Edmund's strange scheme, an unlikely and lasting friendship neither had expected. But Anne, listening beside him, always added the same quiet correction whenever he reached the end of the tale, reminding him gently that he had not found true love by testing 4 women against each other in secret, but by finally learning, after months of watching and judging and disguising himself from the truth of his own heart, to be honest himself, and to recognize honesty when it knelt down beside him on a study floor, asking nothing in return.